Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick comparison between the brand new Sony a7C on the right and the a7R2 on the left. Now, there's a really big gap in terms of the actual age of these cameras. Of course, the a7C just launched. The a7R2 has been on the market since 2015, but there is a good reason that I'm comparing these, and that is price to performance ratio. So, of course, the a7C's entire claim to fame is its form factor. Full frame, 24 megapixel, interchangeable lens camera, of course mirrorless. It benefits from having real-time tracking, eye autofocus, a fairly deep buffer at over 200 images, being able to be consecutively shot, 10 frames per second. You've got the new flip-out display. No new menu system, but a lot of people do love this flip-out display, so that may be enough for them. The EVF is meh. It's actually inferior to the a6600 that sits beneath it on Sony's mirrorless pyramid. The a6600, of course, is an APS-C, not a full-frame camera. And that seems to be the only corner Sony's really cut with this. 4K video at 30 frames per second is stellar on this. The overall capability of this camera is kind of hard to imagine years ago because it did require significantly larger bodies. Then we look at the a7R2. And of course, the key difference here is that the a7R2 is relegated to Sony's larger A7 body style, which is still in style, it's not gone, but the old screen system, which is now looking to be a thing of the past. Now, some people preferred this display, and I was one of them at first when Sony first introduced the new flip-out display, and that was because even though the flip-out display seems to give you more capability, more flexibility overall, one of the things it doesn't give you is the ability in a tight space to actually angle the display. So let's say you're taking a shot and you don't have the ability to flip out the screen to the left. Well, you don't have the ability to frame your shot like this. So, I mean, it's a compromise. So that's something to be aware of. But of course, the key to the a7R2, much like all of the a7Rs, is it lies in its resolution. So over 40 megapixels on this sensor, 24 in the a7C. So do you need that difference in megapixels? And that's really why this is a quick comparison, because in just about every possible way, this 5-year younger camera, the a7C, that is smaller, is better than the a7R2. However, if you are shooting more still than video content, and you do require the extra megapixels, even the fact that the a7R2 has inferior color science, lacks real-time tracking for video, that's why I said primarily still, the a7R2 is just impossible to pass up, in my opinion, at its current pricing. Right now, it retails for $1,200, and that may sound like a lot for a 5-year-old camera, but keep in mind that this 5-year-old camera can still stand up to much of the current competition. Now, from an autofocus perspective, no, it's not going to stand up to the a7C. But do they feel like they're 5 years apart? Yes and no. In terms of the real-time tracking, yeah, that feels like 5 years. And acquiring subjects, tracking the subjects, that's where the a7C shows that it is the brand new camera. But that's not to say that the autofocus system in the a7R2 is trash. It's actually fairly solid. And bear in mind, as I just stated, $1,200 new for this body, $1,800 new for the a7C. So the reason I am sharing this video is that I believe the a7C appeals to a different line of consumer hobbyists, not pros necessarily, that want more capability. They're willing to spend some more money, but they don't want to jump into cameras that are considered pro grade. And quite frankly, the a7R2, which back in 2015 was taking a shot at being a pro grade camera in every way, shape, and form, including its pricing, not just its specifications, right now is a complete bargain. So the moral of the story is, if you can deal with the fact that this camera doesn't have the real-time tracking, doesn't have the new color science, doesn't have the flip-out display, doesn't have the new battery type, which isn't new anymore. This battery type, the FZ1000, started back in, what was it, 2017 with the a7R3. It doesn't have that. It has the old battery type, but even with that old battery type and its lack of support for UHS-2 SD cards, which you won't really need because this doesn't have the buffer, nor does it have the video recording capability to necessarily leverage higher speed cards, you will be getting a higher resolution sensor. You'll still have 5-axis image stabilization in body, which I would argue is just as good as in the brand new a7C. You will not have the gyro data that can be compiled from the a7C and then in post create video that looks like it's stabilized, but there are only several cameras that can actually do that. The a7C, the a7S3, and the ZV-1. No other Sony cameras right now have that functionality to my knowledge. But most importantly, besides the extra megapixels, you'll be getting an EVF that is worlds better than this little piece of crap that's on the left of the a7C. And I call it a piece of crap because it is. The a7C is in every way my dream camera except for its EVF. And I say that because it's all about, again, that size to performance ratio, and the a7C hits it out of the park in both still and video performance. Ergonomics, a lot of people have complained it's too small. It's not that much smaller than the a7R2, but admittedly, the grip is smaller than the a6600, just like the EVF is also inferior to the a6600, which is a less expensive APS-C camera, so that's a little mind-boggling. But the point I'm making here is that, again, when it comes to a photographic tool, the a7R2 is still amazing. Now, it can't, as I've said, outclass the battery life of this camera, the autofocus of this camera, but its resolution is in another class. Now, if you don't care about that added extra resolution, then the a7C should be at the top of your shortlist. But if you are primarily shooting stills and you primarily take those stills to post and you do your own color grading and you're not worried so much about what comes straight out of camera and you primarily shoot with an EVF like I do, then the a7R2, especially at $500 to $600 less, is it $600 less? Yeah, is just almost impossible, in my opinion, to pass up. But the good news here is that if you are trying to make a decision between these two, and I know even though there isn't a lot of chatter about it, people have to be, because at $1,200 and $1,800, you have to say, even though this is 5 years old, it still does 4K 30 with the 5-axis in-body stabilization. The video is still very good. Yeah, it doesn't have, as I've mentioned, the battery life or the real-time tracking or the color science, but it has resolution that the a7C can't come close to. It also has far more customizable buttons. You can see C1, C2, C3, right here, C4, whereas with the a7C, again, if you're primarily a still shooter, you've got one C button right here, and that's the end of the story. Now, there's no joystick on this camera, and there's no joystick on the a7R2 like they incorporated in the a7R3, a7R4, a9, and of course the a7S3. So nothing to really talk about with the joystick, but forget even the customizable buttons. You're even missing the jog dial on the front of the grip that's right here, which does live on the a7R2, 3, and 4. So that's yet another customizable wheel that you are giving up. Of course, both have dedicated aperture control, but it's just, these are things you have to be made aware of. Now, when it comes to beyond what we've discussed, which is raw performance, clearly, ergonomics and overall manual control and EVF and resolution all go to the 5-year-old a7R2. But, as I've mentioned, the modernization all goes to the a7C. So one of the things, really two of them that I'll mention, this little shotgun shotgun mic, if you care about using it, It'll work with the a7R2, but you will have to hardwire it. This was introduced with the a7R4, and it only works natively with the a7R4, a7S3, the a7C, and the a9 Mark II. So just be aware, this is a phenomenal shotgun mic, in my opinion. If it would be able to work the way it does on Sony cameras, which is completely wirelessly, with other cameras, this would be the shotgun mic for everyone to own. But because it is proprietary to so few Sony models, you have to be one of those owners. Otherwise, you will be relegated to, traditional hard wiring. And, that's not for everybody, obviously. So in that case, you may as well buy something that you can use on all of your cameras. But just something I wanted to point out. Another thing, which I bring up often, that I have permanently living on my ZV-1, let that come into focus there. It's really the brightness, a little blown out with that white, that frosty snow white finish on that new ZV-1, is the Bluetooth grip. Now you cannot use this Bluetooth grip with the older a7R2. You can use it with the a7C. Now those decisions I'm bringing up, those possibilities for you, they shouldn't end up determining which camera is right for you, but they are things that if I neglected to mention, I wouldn't be doing you justice on deciding between these two cameras. So again, this isn't in any way, shape, or form about the a7R2 being better than the a7C. It's about which camera is better for you as the consumer, prosumer, photographer, videographer, and in just about every way, as I've mentioned, the a7C is the better choice. But if budget is an issue, the a7R2 is just such a steal in 2020. Even at 5 years old, we have not reinvented the wheel here in terms of photo and video capability. Sony's come a long way, and the a7C reflects that, in that it's smaller, has far superior autofocus, better buffer, weather sealing. It has, of course, a screen that many people do really prefer, obviously, having this capability. No way to film yourself, see yourself on camera with this. But I would argue that anyone who's really relying on this, again, is photo-centric first, video second, and for that, you can use an external display. And with the money you save buying the a7R2, that can go towards glass, that can go towards an external affordable monitor. God knows they've become so cheap these days, and that's important to know. Of course, neither camera has a flash. Most cameras of this nature, of this quality, don't. But it's just something to be aware of. And when it comes to again, ergonomics, they're pretty similar, because only in Gen 3 of the R line did we get the bulkier grip that got even larger with the Mark IV. And that was because of the changeover on battery from W series to Z. Now, battery life, it's a big deal. But batteries are also less expensive for the R2, so keep that in mind. So even though the W series, or rather I should say the Z series that's inside the a7C, the R4, the R3, the A9 II, the a7S3, gets, even the a6600, lest I forget the good old little APS-C gem, gets 2.5 times the battery life of the old W series batteries. The W series batteries are half the price. And of course, you can buy generic batteries for both of these and save even more money. Just make sure you get generics that are true and not just clones that rip you off on Amazon. I've covered a few in the past. So Vemico comes to mind. So again, just things to be aware of. And I felt the fact that I was looking at the two of these and saying, if I had no cameras and I had to choose which would I pick, that's the reason I'm sharing this with all of you. I feel like they're very similarly sized, close enough in price, and of course, it really comes down to what you plan on doing. Now, as I stated really from the beginning of the video, the a7C is the better hybrid because it has all of the benefits of Sony's latest tech. Most importantly, that real-time tracking and eye autofocus refined, as good as it's going to get outside of the a7S3 and the a7R4 and the color science. But I already told you, the EVF, if you primarily use an electronic viewfinder, This is going to make you a lot happier, even though it's 5 years old. For me personally, the placement, not being flush left, I'm left eye dominant. That's a big difference. And then in addition, just the field of view and resolution is actually better on this, even though it's 5 years old. So these are things to be aware of. Autofocus, this is a slower camera. You're looking at 5 frames per second versus 10 frames per second with the a7C, which matches the performance of my a7R4. So that, if you're trying to shoot in burst mode, then this is going to be a better camera for you. But there's a reason this didn't have as high a frame rate capture capability, and that's because it was about the high resolution sensor. So I said this would be a quick comparison. It's over 15 minutes. I'm going to stop now. I think you get the idea. If you're photo first, this is a camera that is a steal, especially if you're buying it in the used market. That's part of the reason I won't sell it, is because it's not worth giving up even at $1,200. Forget, you can probably find them used for, $1,000, $800, $900. I was going to say printing money, but that wouldn't make sense. But you know what I mean. That is so cheap for what this camera is capable of. And yeah, there are better cameras on the market, but try finding better cameras for that price. And by the way, when it comes to shooting video, the a7C doesn't just have autofocus advantages, it has overheating limitations and advantages in that department too. The a7R2, if you're doing short video, you'll be fine, but it is relegated to, of course, the under 30-minute cap, and then in addition to that, it will overheat in a way that this camera is less prone, and you can lift those limitations. So just be aware of it. One last thing to point out, the slow and quick high frame rate captures better on this, but that's again a product of a more mature camera. But that pretty much rounds things out. I mean, personally, if budget was not an issue, I would go with the a7C because it has everything going for it. But if you are coming from a budget-oriented decision, which most people are, because not everybody's rolling in dough, right? The a7R2 is just really hard to pass at $1,200 US, even with it being 5 years old, even with the fact that its screen can't flip out to the side, even with the fact that it doesn't have continuous autofocus, it doesn't have the new color science. I mean, it is just still a really compelling camera that you easily can still use to make money as a professional photographer, both in studio and outside. Video, that's a little bit more difficult considering the overheating limitations with the options that exist today and at such inexpensive prices. But holy moly, the a7R2 is a steal. But as I said, if budget is a non-issue, a7C all day. But still thought this would be a helpful video for anyone trying to decide between these two here in, yes, believe it or not, 2020. The a7R2 is still incredibly capable, competent, and relative to just about anyone with a proclivity for taking high quality images. And don't forget that EVF. Oh, I love it. Compared to this, it's just amazing. Of course, the a7R3 4 better, and then the a7S III, the most amazing EVF out there. The A9 Mark II did not get blessed with as good an EVF as the a7R4 that I use regularly. But that rounds it out. Again, I just wanted to address this because I feel like this, for at least some of you, is a pressing question. Just like whether or not I covered whether or not it's worth purchasing the a7C over an A6000 series, an APS-C body. But I think this is far more compelling. I would purchase the a7R2 over, believe it or not, an A6600. That might make some of your heads spin, but I'd rather have the additional resolution than an APS-C sensor, less dynamic range. We're getting into a whole other ball of wax. But that rounds it out. Again, a7C or a7R2, which is right for you. If budget is guiding your choice, you're not going to be upset with this. You'll just need to buy some extra batteries, maybe an external monitor if you plan on shooting a lot of video or vlogging. And yeah, that's it. Oh, and by the way, the a7C being lighter, it is beneficial besides the gyro capability for stabilization in post when you have no stabilization on. throwing this on a gimbal is obviously beneficial because it is a smaller, lighter camera than the a7R2. But that rounds it out. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.